we're going to be, within the Shamatha Retreat, we're going to be moving on to the second and third objects that we briefly mentioned on Friday evening. So yesterday we focused on the breath as the object of Shamatha practice, and we looked at those three variations of the full body, which is particularly useful for cultivating relaxation. We then moved on to focusing at the area of the abdomen, which is very helpful for stabilizing the mind. And then finally, we moved to the nostrils, which can be very good for improving clarity of attention. Today, we're going to, in this session, we're going to be focusing on the mind as the object. And in the next session, we're going to be looking at the awareness of awareness practice, or sometimes called shamatha with no object. And then again, after lunch today, we're going to go back to the compassion wing of the practice. And today we're actually going to look at the cultivating of compassion. And then in the last session this afternoon, we're going to look at a lot more about integration, how to integrate these various practices into our daily life, and finishing at 4 o'clock today. So let's launch into having a look at the shamatha practice, observing the mind. Now, many people find this particular practice more challenging, not really because it's complicated, but again, it's simply because we're not used to doing that. So in this practice, we are simply observing our own mind and whatever mental events arise within our mind. So observing things like thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images, simply observing these mental events as they arise and pass. And so many people find this quite challenging because, one, that the mind is more subtle object than the breath. And secondly, is we tend to have a very strong habit of always identifying with our mental events and following them. Or if we don't like them, suppressing them. So we tend to be caught up in this these two habits of either identifying and following or suppressing. So to actually sit back and observe them as they arise and pass, many people find very challenging. Again, not because it's complicated, just simply we don't have the habit. But the reason we're using this object in this retreat is that I think for many of us in our modern society, using the mind as the object of shamatha practice can bring enormous benefit. Because as we saw on particularly Friday evening, many of us in our modern society tend to be the slaves of our mind. We are tormented by our own mind, and really, and basically our mind is our worst enemy instead of potentially being our best friend. So here in this practice, we are learning the ability to be the observer or witness of our own mind. So instead of getting caught up in all of our mental events and getting overwhelmed by them, we can simply be present with them. And of course, if we can learn to be present with all these mental events and simply observe them arise and pass, we're not feeding them. Because every time we identify with our thoughts and so forth, or try to suppress them, we're feeding them. So the habit of them coming up will get stronger and stronger. Whereas if we simply can be present with them, observe them arise and pass, we're not feeding them. So our mind will over time then naturally become more quiet and still. And also because then we're learning to be present with these mental events, then they can't actually do anything to harm us. Because in themselves, they have really no power. They only have power if we give them power, by identifying with them or trying to suppress them. So by doing this practice, not only will we become the masters of our mind and our mind will become our best friend, but also if some strong mental event were to arise, we could then simply be present with it without it overwhelming us. So there are enormous benefits to this practice. And also by doing this practice of observing the mind and mental events, we start to really get to understand the nature of our mind. And so it's possible, even though this is a shamatha practice, that simply doing the shamatha practice, we can start to have some intuitive insight into the nature of the mind, which of course is vipassana practice. So this is also a very good bridge into the vipassana practice. So before we jump into the practice, let's have a look at the practice in a little bit more detail. And for this, I'd like to read a little bit from a book called Attention Revolution by Alan Wallace. And he describes this practice in a very good way. So I'll read what he says about this practice and then make a few more comments. And he calls this practice of observing the mind in shamatha, settling the mind in its natural state. That's the name he gives to this practice. And he says the following: the object of mindfulness in the practice of settling the mind in its natural state is no longer the subtle sensations of the breath at the nostrils, but the space of the mind and whatever events arise within that space. The object of introspection, as in the earlier practice of mindfulness of breathing, is the quality of the attention with which you're observing the mind. So here, the object is the space of the mind and all the mental events that arise in that space. So one thing we need to remember in this practice is we're only observing mental events, meaning sensory events we're not interested in. So in this practice, if a sound arises, a tactile sensation in the body, some visual object, we're not paying attention to any sort of sensory objects, only mental objects. That's what we're observing in this practice. He goes on to say, at the beginning, have many daily sessions, each of them brief duration, and focus well in each one. So again, the idea of quality over quantity. So again, we're going to be doing a 20-minute session here. Whenever you meditate, bear in the mind the phrase, without distraction and without grasping, and put this into practice. As you venture into this practice, I would encourage you to memorize these quintessential instructions, which are: settle your mind without distraction and without grasping. Practicing without distraction means not allowing your mind to be carried away by thoughts and sense impressions. Be present here and now, and when thoughts arise pertaining to the past or future or ruminations about the present, don't be abducted by them. As you hike on this trail of shamatha, don't be a hitchhiker, catching a ride with any of the thoughts or images that whiz through your mind. Rather, be like a kestrel hovering motionlessly as it faces the wind, slightly moving its wings and tail feathers to adjust to changes in currents of the air. Even when your attention is settled in the present, you may still grasp onto appearances to the mind. Whenever you prefer one mental object over another, whenever you try to control the contents of the mind, or whenever you identify with anything at all, grasping has set in. Here is the challenge at hand. Be attentive to everything that comes up in the mind, but don't grasp onto anything. In this practice, let your mind be like the sky. Whatever moves through it, the sky never reacts. It doesn't stop anything from moving through it, nor through it. It doesn't hold on to anything that's present, nor does it control anything. The sky doesn't prefer rainbows to clouds, butterflies to jet planes. Whatever comes up in the field of awareness, without distraction or grasping, just let it be. So this is one of the key instructions here, is just let it be. So in this practice, thoughts are not problems. We're not trying to make the mind still. If you've ever tried to make your mind still, you know it doesn't work. Just let it be, of course, doesn't mean get caught up in thoughts. Let them be means simply observe them as they arise and pass. So we're not trying to block thoughts, and of course we're not identifying with them and following them. You're simply observing them as they arise and pass. Now, in this practice, it's very much recommended to have the eyes open. I mean, in general in meditation, the general recommendation is have to at least slightly open. Particularly in this practice, to have the eyes open, either slightly or just naturally open. And there are a number of beneficial reasons to do that. And again, I'd like to read a little bit from Alan Wallace about that, and then I'll make some more comments on that. So the very short instruction here is, let your gaze be vacant. And what does that mean? He says, in this practice, it is important that your eyes are open, vacantly resting your gaze in the space in front of you. If you have not meditated with your eyes open, you may find this uncomfortable, but I encourage you to get used to it. Blink as often as you like, and don't strain your eyes in any way. Let them be as relaxed as if you were daydreaming with your eyes open. By leaving the eyes open, while focusing your attention on the domain of mental events, the artificial barrier between inner and outer begins to dissolve. Especially in our materialist society, we have gotten used to the idea that all our thoughts and all our other mental events are inside our heads. But this has never been demonstrated scientifically. All that is known in this regard is that mental events are correlated with neural events, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are located in the same place. Even without this materialist assumption that the mind is nothing more than a function of the brain, we naturally have a sense that we are looking out on the world from behind our eyes. But this sense of an independent subject or ego inside the head is an illusion. There is no scientific support for such a belief. And when it is inspected through rigorous contemplative inquiry, this autonomous thinker and observer inside the head is nowhere to be found. In this practice, by leaving your eyes open but directing your attention to the mind, this conceptually superimposed demarcation between inner and outer begins to erode. You begin to recognize that your thoughts are not occurring in here in your head, nor are they occurring out there in space. This practice challenges the existence of an absolutely objective space of the physical senses that is absolutely separate from the subjective space of the mind. You are now on a path to realizing the meaning of non-duality. So just a few comments on that. As he said, when initially I started meditating with my eyes closed because I was very agitated, even if I had them slightly open, that made more agitation. So for many years I meditated with the eyes closed. And then some years ago when I got introduced to this practice, as he said, when I first started meditating with the eyes open, I found it very uncomfortable. But actually quite quickly I got used to it. And as he said, there are a number of benefits with this practice. And remember, with the eyes open, we're not straining the eyes. So you blink as often as you like, keep them relaxed. And by leaving the eyes open, and again, we're not really looking at anything. We're just vacantly resting our gaze in the space in front of us. But because of that, our visual perception is somewhat engaged. And visual perception, of course, only happens in the present moment. So I find that having the eyes open, it helps to lock me more into the present moment. With the eyes closed, it's much easier to drift into the past and the future. And of course, also by having the eyes open, that can really help with clarity, because again, with the eyes closed, it's much easier to fall into dullness. And also, as Alan Wallace mentioned, with the eyes open, it really starts to break down this false sense of duality. With the eyes closed, we really do have a sense there's a me in here and a world out there. By having the eyes open, this false sense of duality is not so strong, and that's going to really help us, particularly later, moving into the Vipassana practice, where we're trying to come to realize non-duality. And also by having the eyes open in this practice and observing the mental events with the eyes open, then it's much easier to transition into daily life. and to be able to do that in daily life. Because if we meditate with the eyes closed, observing the mind, and get in the habit of observing mental events with the eyes closed, then when we transition to daily life with the eyes generally open, then we don't have the habit of observing thoughts with eyes open. Whereas if we're meditating eyes open, observing thoughts, then it's much easier to transition and be able to do that in daily life as well. So there are all these benefits with having the eyes open. So again, with the eyes open, slightly or just naturally. And I'll talk a little bit more about that after this meditation. So that's the practice that we're going to do. Any questions about the practice before we go into the practice? Anyone have any confusion or doubts about the practice?
So about suppression of thoughts.
Sure.
Because sometimes when thoughts are rather negative,
yeah, sure,
then we say thank you, but no thank you. Is that the same as suppression?
So as he mentioned, the key point is preference. If you prefer them not to be there, then there's some suppression. Of course, there can be very heavy suppression or not so heavy. So again, we're trying to get into this state of not grasping, which includes not suppressing. And one way to check is we don't care whether it's there or not, either pleasant or unpleasant. That's the sort of state of mind. It's just a mental event that happens to be arising, and we don't prefer it to be there or not to be there. So that's sort of the gauge of whether we're suppressing. If we're getting into the mode of, well, I don't really want that to be there, I don't like it to be there, then there will be some sort of suppression going on. So we're trying to get into that sort of mode.
This is a slight difference between mindfulness meditation, where we keep coming back to the object, no thank you, I'm coming back to the object. Now we're saying, be there, I'm watching, and actually there's no substance, so come and go
exactly. This is the difference, for example, between this practice and the breath practice. In the breath practice, thoughts are problems, they're obstacles, so we have to let them go and come back to the breath. Here, thoughts are not problems, so as we saw, to let them be. But let them be, of course, doesn't mean entertain them and follow them or try to suppress them. It's just that if they happen to be there, just watch them as they arise and pass. If there's nothing there, just observe that empty space and have no preference. Have no preference for this thought over that thought, and even have no preference for a still mind than a mind that's full of thoughts. So we're not trying to make the mind still. So if you prefer for the mind to be quiet, we're still grasping. So just have no preference, and whatever's there, observe it. If there's nothing there, observe that space. A thought or emotion or memory or whatever mental event comes up, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, just observe it arise and pass. That's it.
Just showing the mind equanimity.
Yeah, in that sense, yes. Okay. Yeah.
I've just been observing this, and seems to go quiet, and then my heart pounds, and my breath seems really. Now I'm really in contact with my nose. So now what? I'm quiet. There doesn't seem to be anything arising, so there's a kind of panic feeling.
Yeah.
And then my heart, then I can get really in touch with my heart, and then suddenly I'm really feeling the nostrils.
Yeah. And this is something I was going to bring up later, but I'll mention it briefly now, is that particularly as we progress in this practice, you're going to get periods where there's not a lot of mental events arising. Now, and particularly if you have the body in a good posture, so you don't have a strong sense of body, then with no strong sense of body and no mental events arising, then there's nothing reinforcing our sense of me. Because our sense of me is reinforced by solid body and mental events. And suddenly now we don't have a sense of a solid body anymore because it's very relaxed and quiet and not creating problems. And suddenly all the mental events which are reinforcing our identity are not there. So then the natural thing is that we develop a lot of fear and anxiety because there's no me that I'm familiar with here anymore. But what we need to understand is that there's no danger in resting in that spacious state of awareness, and understand, and so to really appreciate that. So if you find that there is some of this anxiety or fear coming up, is to really appreciate that there's no fear in remaining in that open, spacious state.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Let's do the practice then. So again, we'll do 20-minute session.
Ja. Hvor du den? Nej.
So allowing your awareness to descend into the body. Simply becoming aware of sensations throughout the body. And using the out breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And bringing your awareness to the area of the face, softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. Allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And then we can take 3 slow, deep breaths, maintaining awareness of sensations throughout the body as you breathe. And then allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. And then give yourselves permission that for the duration of this short meditation, simply let go of any hopes or fears, worries or concerns about the past or the future. And simply allow the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. And simply focus on the sensations of the breath throughout the body. Now allow your eyes to be at least partially open, vacantly resting your gaze in the space in front of you. Keeping the eyes soft and relaxed, and blinking as often as you need to. And now bring your attention to your own mind and simply observe your own mind and whatever mental events are arising in the mind. Thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images. Without following thoughts, without trying to get rid of thoughts. Simply observing them as they arise and pass, without grasping to them, without becoming distracted. if you're new to this practice and you're not really sure what to focus on, then every now and again, deliberately generate a thought. Any thought will do. And simply watch that thought as it arises in your mind. And then watch it as it disappears back into the space of the mind. And then keep your attention right where it was. And simply wait for the next thought to appear in that space. Now, if you've found that you've got caught up in a thought and got carried away, then again, the first thing to do is simply to relax. And then release grasping onto that thought and very gently return to observing the mind. So relax, release, and return every time you get carried away by a thought. And if you find you're just drifting into dullness or being spaced out, then use the in-breath as an opportunity to arouse and refresh your focus on the mind. Now release all appearances and simply allow the mind to come to rest. Resting in the experience of awareness itself. So simply be aware of being aware. So how did we go? Able to observe anything?
Terrible.
Terrible.
Pounding and my face is on fire and my hands on fire.
Because you're trying too hard, or?
No, I'm relaxed. I'm just looking at it, and I just suddenly feel my whole body, and it's just horrible.
I mean, as you mentioned before, one thing can be is that if your body's relaxed and there's not a lot of mental events coming up, then there's nothing reinforcing our normal sense of me, which is constantly reinforced in our daily life through solid body mental events. That's what we identify with as me. We identify with this solid body, and we identify with these mental events as me. And that actually creates us a lot of suffering. And so now in this meditation, if we're relaxing the body and we don't have a solid sense of body, and these mental events start to quieten down, there's nothing reinforcing our false sense of me. And for us now, there seems to be just two possibilities. Either there is this me that is the body and the mind, or there's no me. So then often when we're in this spacious state, nothing reinforcing a false sense of me, then often a lot of fear and anxiety comes in because we feel like I'm going out of existence. But what we need to realize, and we can do this through thinking about things, is that that's a false sense of me, because we're not, particularly when we look at the Vipassana practice, as in the next weekend retreat, we'll come to realize that we are not our body, we are not our mental events. And so therefore, resting in that spacious state, there's no need to have any fear or anxiety that we're going out of existence or I don't exist or anything. This is a false sense. And then we can relax into that experience. So, yeah.
It's just a sudden get the heart pumping.
No, this is a very common experience in not just this practice, but in many practices where we don't have something reinforcing the false sense of me.
Right.
And unfortunately, what sometimes happens is people come to these experiences without having any framework of practice.
Right.
So they experience this sort of spacious, empty state and they freak out and they don't know how to interpret it. And often they feel like, I'm going crazy, I don't really exist, you know, all of these misinterpretations of that experience. And then they just stop practicing because they think, oh, no, there's something wrong here, or it's freaking me out. Whereas the problem is the misinterpretation of what that experience means.
Right.
So if we develop some good framework, then we'll understand that experience is not meaning that I'm going crazy or I don't exist or whatever. Okay. And then we can just stay in that experience because that's a valid experience and we're moving in a good direction.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Okay, I'm super active from here and up, and then the rest is relaxed and not there and fine and neutral or whatever. But there's a lot of activity going on, and it
you mean mental activity?
Yeah, mental activity. And as soon as I opened my eyes, I was like, okay, what's the point actually? I'm not looking at anything anyway, so why can't I just have them shut? Because that's sort of the same. But again, I could just register this extreme activity as soon as my eyes were open.
I mean, the reality is that we have a lot of mental activity. And as we saw in that Shamatha chart yesterday, the 9 stages, we saw at the first stage, our mind is chaotic, you know, the elephant monkey running wildly. In this practice of observing the mind resting in awareness, they also have a model in terms of progress in this practice. Usually they don't use that model, the 9 stages with the elephant monkey. They have what's called a 4-stage model. And the first stage of progress in this practice, the analogy is like a waterfall of thoughts crashing down. And so that's is actually the first stage of practice, is to notice how much mental events are in our mind. They're just one after the other, non-stop. So that actually is the first stage of practice, to notice that, because now it's happening, but we are so caught up in looking out there, we don't notice all this stuff going on in the mind. So that is actually the first stage of practice, to notice that it's a waterfall of thoughts crashing down on us. And then this model says that if we continue to practice and don't feed those thoughts, then instead of a waterfall of thoughts crashing down, it will be like a fast flowing river. And then the next third stage is a slow moving river, where we notice less mental events and sort of a gap between one event and the other of quiet. And then eventually that slow moving river will empty into a still ocean or lake. So that's the 4 stages we go through. So this is the first sign of progress in this practice, is crashing down thoughts. And again, for the eyes open, as we mentioned, there are a number of benefits. One, of course, is it helps to improve clarity. With the eyes closed, it's much easier to go into dullness. With the eyes closed, it's much easier to drift into the past and the future. And also, with the eyes closed, we have this false sense of a me in here and a world out there. And also, with the eyes open, if we get used to observing thoughts with eyes open in meditation, we can more easily do that in daily life, because normally in daily life we're having eyes open. So if we get used to observing our thoughts with eyes open in meditation, then in daily life it's much easier to do that, because we want to be able to do that in daily life as well. So the transition is much easier.
Because if I'm with my eyes open, as soon as there's a word, I'm caught. I'm caught in that thought as soon as there's words. But if I'm to observe me observing my thoughts, then I don't get caught in the words, because the words are not there.
Sorry, you lost me there.
Okay, so when I'm observing my thoughts, they become words. As soon as they're words, I'm caught in them. Then, okay, then I take a step backwards. But then when you guided us and say, okay, observe that you are observing, they're no longer words in my system over here. And then that's way much easier. And that was nice, having my eyes open with that state, but not with the observing.
Yeah. So the last few minutes of that practice was actually the practice we're going to do in the next session. And that is the awareness of awareness practice. So in that practice, we are simply becoming aware of being aware. And there still will be, of course, mental events arising in that practice. But in this practice, which is coming in the next session, is we're not interested in any of those appearances. We're not observing them. They'll arise and pass. We're just basically ignoring them. So therefore, people find sometimes this practice a little bit easier, because if we try to observe them, our habit is get caught up and follow. So that's one thing. And then there was another thing I wanted to mention. With this practice now of observing the thoughts, as a beginner, usually there are 2 main types of experiences. The first is that there are thoughts everywhere and we just get carried away, always. Thought comes, gone. So to help us with that, because then we get a bit despondent. Oh, I can't watch anything because I'm just constantly carried away, and we sort of feel despondent. To help with that, what we can do is a little bit what I did in this meditation, is deliberately generate a thought. You know, just generate a thought, particularly one that's not emotionally charged, that doesn't grip you. So just have a thought or an image of something. Because if we generate it, we know it's coming. We're expecting it. Whereas normally thoughts and emotions and memories don't announce themselves. They just pop up, and then before we know it, we're caught away with them. Whereas if we're generating it, we know it's coming. So then we can watch it as it arises and pass. And then we have some feeling of success. Oh, yes, I managed to watch one thought. So what we can do then as a beginner is every now and again we can do this. We can just deliberately generate something and watch it. And then we have some feeling, yes, I think I can do it a little bit. and that can encourage us to go. So that's one thing we can do. Another thing we can do, of course, is as a beginner, we can use the breath as an anchor. So what is possible is that initially to mainly focus on the breath, particularly down, because again, mental activity up here, usually we sense it. So what can be useful is in this practice, if we find that we're always getting swept away, is simply focus on the abdomen, most of the attention, and a little bit of attention on what's going on in the mind. And that's sort of holding us. Yeah. And then slowly have less attention on the abdomen and more on what's going on in the mind. And then slowly move towards observing more the mind, less the abdomen, and then eventually just the mind. So in that way, we can sort of anchor ourselves a little bit in the initial phases. So that's something we can do. Another possibility is that when a mental event comes up, is to label it, give it a name. Because if we give it a name, then it becomes an object, and it's harder then to get caught up in it. So if you have some thought or mental image or memory come up, then give it a name like memory, anger, thought. Because if you give it a name, it becomes an object, and then it's much easier to observe. So you might, that's another little thing you can do is giving names to mental events, and then that gives you, then it becomes really an object. So these are some things that we can do if we're just constantly carried away. The other most common experience that people have as a beginner is they sit down and then suddenly there's no thoughts, there's no mental events. Now, generally, that's not because suddenly our mind has become quiet. There are a couple of reasons why that happens. The most common reason as a beginner is that we're going into our normal way of focus, and that is with tension. So we go into this practice and we tense to focus because we know if we don't, we're going to get swept away. So we tense. But that tension of focus is really suffocating our mind. There's no space for anything to come up. So what we need to do if we find ourselves intensely focusing is relax that. But don't relax too much, otherwise you get swept away. So there's this delicate balance of not having too much tension and not being too relaxed. The normal challenge in this, that middle way. So, and then of course, another thing why often there's nothing there is that our mind is not very clear. You know, like when we started focusing here at the nostrils, many people notice virtually nothing, you know, there's nothing here. But it's not because there's nothing there, it's just because our clarity is not there. I mean, there's sensations going on here all the time, but usually we don't notice it because our mind is not very clear. So similarly with this practice, you'll find there's a lot of mental activity going on all the time, but a lot of it is below the threshold of our awareness because our mind is not very clear. So if we can just stay there observing, and as the clarity slowly improves, the threshold of our awareness will go down and we'll start to pick up a lot of this mental activity that usually is below the level of our radar. So that's another thing. And then of course, sometimes our mind is actually quite still. If that's the case, then just observe that space of stillness. Just observe that stillness and then wait for some event to arise in that state. So that's some advice about what to do as a beginner. Anyone have any other points or questions about this practice?
You can't help getting stuck. The three things that you just said, when do you know you're in one and when do you know you're in the other? Okay, now I'm just tensing up, and then there's this other one of I'm completely blank because I'm just not observing what is supposed, you know, I could easily get hooked up in that.
So again, remember, with this practice, don't go into it with expectation. Or the reverse of expectation, of worry, you know, oh, I can't do it, because this is just going to create problems. So again, just Shanti Deva's advice, no matter how difficult something seems, everything with practice becomes easy. So just keep practicing and don't have this unrealistic expectation of being able to observe, because we've spent 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years following our thoughts, emotions, and memories and so forth, or trying to suppress them. That is our strong habit we actively develop every single day of our lives. And to think that from one moment to the next we can change that habit is completely unrealistic.
Right.
So of course it'll take time and effort, but every little bit of effort we do, we slowly improve. And slowly over time, we're going to start to better able to observe our thoughts, emotions, and memories. So don't come into it with this completely unrealistic expectation that we'll be able to do it from the very beginning, because it's just not going to happen. And then if we don't have that expectation, we won't get frustrated when we can't do it, and we'll just patiently persist and keep going. Patience, patience, persistence. That's it. And be kind to yourself. Don't beat yourself up. You know, oh, I'm hopeless, I can't do it. You know, it's just practice. That's all.
Wow, there's a lot of things involved in this just simple practice. Kindness and patience and diligence. And
Sure, sure, sure. I mean, again, step by step, step by step. Any other questions? Okay. Actually, it's, I wanted to do another meditation, but I think it's maybe good to take a break, and then we'll come back in 15 minutes and do this practice again before we move on to the awareness practice. So let's take a 15-minute tea break and come back.
Sure.
It's kind of the opposite. So I'm now relaxing. I go into. So I just massage the muscles around before, and then I'm already sort of hold it up. Now I'm going to do this in place. And then, I've got a new limb fixing it.
But you can also adjust to your foot.
You know, my ankles. I actually have problems with my ankles, but it went to the knees.
Well, that's it. So the knee is the child of the ankle and the hips. Mom and dad. So you can, spend some care around the ankles with the hips. And,
It's like they're shot.
yeah,
They're shot.
they're short. Oh, yeah. You've got people to help you. Yeah.
Take care.
Some clever people. Some good people. Story like this.
So let's go straight back into the practice. We'll do another 20-minute meditation using the mind as the object of practice. A little bit more comment about that after the meditation, and then we'll move on to the awareness of awareness practice. So finding a nice comfortable posture. As always, we begin by preparing the body, setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. and setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Not dwelling in the past, not anticipating the future. Simply allowing the mind to rest in the present moment. Focusing on the sensations of the breath throughout the body. And then allowing the eyes to be at least partially open. Vacantly resting your gaze in the space in front of you. And bring your attention to your own mind. And simply observe your own mind and whatever is arising in the space of the mind. Simply be an impartial observer or witness, observing thoughts as they arise and pass, without grasping to them, without becoming distracted. Remember, thoughts are not problems. Grasping to thoughts is the problem. So we're not trying to make the mind still. If the mind is still, observe that stillness. If the mind is moving, observe that movement. Observing thoughts as they arise and pass. If you find that you're not able to observe thoughts, or you're simply becoming spaced out, then every now and again deliberately generate a thought and just watch it as it arises in your mind, and watch it as it disappears back into the space of your mind. And then simply keep your attention right where it was and wait for the next thought to appear in that space. Now, if you find that you're constantly being carried away by your thoughts, then you might like to experiment with labeling or noting, meaning giving the mental event a name as a way of helping to stabilize the mind, to avoid getting caught up in that mental event. And if you're becoming bored with the practice, or becoming frustrated not being able to do the practice well, then simply observe that boredom or frustration. Whatever is arising in the mind, simply observe it. Now release all appearances and simply allow the mind to come to rest. Resting in awareness itself. So simply be aware of being aware. Of course, all sorts of appearances will continue to arise, but now pay no attention to any appearance and simply rest in the experience of awareness. Being aware of being aware. Does anyone have any questions or comments about the practice?
So there's in the periphery of my eyesight, when I'm busy just looking, then there's this color change all the time, and there's this mosaic of things moving around and stuff. What's this?
Yeah. That can be a number of things. One sometimes is that we are straining the eyes, and that can create all sorts of visual distortion. So with the eyes open, it's important not to strain the eyes. So we're not trying to like not blink. We're not trying to like, sometimes what people do is, because we're not really looking at anything, people try and deliberately unfocus, you know, so they sort of go like cross-eyed, or they strain the eyes to blur it deliberately. And then of course they get a lot of tension and stress and around the eyes, so we don't want to do that. So keeping them soft and relaxed, but also you will find sometimes that you will have sorts of visual things happening. What can be very helpful is when we do this in our normal place, is we can control a little bit what's in front of us, because you know, often in a group like in setting like this, maybe there's people in front of you and they're moving, and that sort of catches your attention, or there's some sort of flickering candle or movement somewhere, and that pulls your attention. Whereas at home, you can sort of do a little bit the Zen approach and have like a blank wall in front of you, and you can adjust the lighting. Personally, I like quite dim. Some people who dull like a little bit more light. And also with the eyes, you can adjust the gaze. You know, if you're the sort of person that gets easily dull, then you can raise it a little bit. If you're getting a bit agitated, you can lower it. And also, one thing that quite a number of people, including myself, used in the last 8-week retreat I did, particularly doing this practice, there's a thing called a mind fold, which is like you know, your normal things you sometimes have in planes for. It's like that, but it's actually a proper mask that gives space. It's foam around here, and it's completely black.
Wow.
So then you can put this on, and you can have your eyes open without anything. So you might like to try that as well. I used it quite a lot in the last retreat. And Alan Wallace was really recommending it as well. It's called a mind fold. But if you want, you can just make your own, because the ones you normally get sort of flash on your eyes and they're sort of a bit, whereas this sits out, and so you have a space around the eyes, but it's completely black. It's complete, so you can have your eyes open and not be pulled by stuff around you. So you might like to try that as well. I used it quite a lot.
What's the point then if it's all black? I mean, then it's like having the eyes closed.
Not really, because you're actually having your eyes open. I mean, you're not seeing anything, but you still have the sense of the eyes open. And with that, it's black, but there's a different experience with that than the eyes closed, because with the eyes closed, you really have a sense of inner and outer. Whereas with that, because the eyes are actually open, you have this experience of blackness, but there's not a sense of in and out. And also with the eyes open, even though it's dark, you're still in the habit of observing thoughts with the eyes open, which will translate into daily life. So very helpful, I found. So you might like to try that as well.
Cool.
Anything else anyone would like to bring up?
Just I found it hard to keep the eyes open, just because normally when I meditate, I mean that with closed eyes, or like maybe like barely open, but you actually have them more open. They don't really want to do it. They keep shutting.
Personally, I find the sort of having them slightly open is sort of, I find that more difficult. For this meditation, I just have them naturally open. I find that easier.
Wow.
If I have them half open, it gets sort of a bit of the flickering effect. So for me, it works better just to have them naturally open. But as you like. Okay, I just want to add a little bit more to this practice, reading again from Alan Wallace before we go on to the next practice of this awareness of awareness. So here he talks a little bit more about this practice of observing the mind, which again he calls settling the mind in its natural state. And he says the following: When you first begin the practice of settling the mind in its natural state, you may have difficulty identifying the intangible domain of the mind. Or even if you do settle your awareness there, after some time your attention may become vague, disoriented, or spaced out. If you have difficulty identifying the domain of the mind or sustaining attention there, consciously bring up a thought such as, "What is the mind?" and attend to it. Don't think about this question or try to answer it. Just observe the thought itself, watching it emerge in the field of consciousness and then dissolve back into that space. Once it's gone, keep your focus right where the thought was and see what comes up next. If you slip back into a kind of lax, mindless vacuity, deliberately generate the thought again and observe it with bare attention. When you become familiar with this practice, you will no longer need to generate such a thought to crystallize your awareness and locate your attention. That will happen by itself as thoughts arise and pass of their own accord. The practice of attending to the space of the mind and whatever events arise there is like taking a naturalist's field trip into the wilderness of your mind. When you first embark on this inward journey, you may perceive very little. But as you grow more accustomed to this practice, you will begin to identify an increasing quantity and range of mental phenomena. Some of them are discrete, like thoughts and images, while others are nebulous, like emotions and moods. This practice provides you with experiential access to a domain that cannot be observed with any of the instruments of modern science or technology. The most they can do is detect the neural and behavioral correlates of the phenomena you are observing directly. You have become a naturalist of the mind, and a whole new world is opening up to you that for most people remains largely unconscious. In this practice, the locus of awareness gradually descends from the superficial level of coarse mental activity that is immediately accessible through introspection, down into the inner recesses of the mind that are normally below the threshold of consciousness. You discover in this training that the border between conscious and unconscious mental events shifts in relation to the degrees of relaxation, stability, and vividness of attention. Especially when you engage in this practice for many hours each day, for days, weeks, or months at a time, you dredge the depths of your own psyche. In doing so, you remember long forgotten experiences, both pleasant and unpleasant, and a wide range of desires and emotions. What happens here is a kind of luminously clear, discerning, free association of thoughts, mental images, memories, desires, fantasies, and emotions. You are plumbing the depths of your own mind, undistracted by external diversions. Once hidden phenomena are unmasked through the lack of suppression of whatever comes up. This is potentially an extraordinarily deep kind of therapy, and the more intensively you practice it, the more important it is to proceed under the guidance of an experienced, compassionate teacher. During your meditation sessions, internalize the wisdom of this contemplative tradition and make sure that you implement the core instructions of this practice, which are, whatever arises in the mind, do not be carried away by it and do not grasp onto or identify with it. Just let it be. Watch thoughts, feelings, or other mental events arise. With discerning intelligence, be aware of their nature and let them slip back into the space of awareness without any judgment or intervention on your part. This is key to letting the knots of the psyche unravel themselves as the extraordinary healing capacity of the mind reveals itself. This is the path to deep sanity. Yes. That's what we want.
Oh, Ellen, yes.
Okay, let's now look at the third variation of shamatha practice from this retreat. And that is sometimes called shamatha with no object, or sometimes called awareness of awareness. And we've already done it a little bit in the last two meditations. The last few minutes of each of those meditations, I've said something like, release all appearances and simply allow the mind to come to rest, and simply be aware of being aware. So this is the practice that we're going to look at now. So the difference, of course, between this practice and the one we've just been doing is that in this practice of awareness, experientially, it's a much more non-dualistic practice. The practice of observing the mind, experientially, we have a sense of being the observer or the witness, and we are observing the mind as an object and all the mental events arising in that space. Whereas in this practice, it's much more of a non-dualistic experience. There's no real sense of being a separate observer or witness. So we are simply resting in awareness itself. So often the analogy with the mind practice is that the mind is like the sky and the thoughts are like clouds moving through the sky. So there we are observing the sky and all the thoughts moving through it. This awareness of awareness practice is more about being the sky than observing the sky. So here we are simply resting in the experience of awareness itself. And in this practice, we're not interested in any appearances. Of course, appearances will continue to arise. Of course, thoughts, emotions, memories, and so forth will still arise in that mind, in the mind or awareness. But in this practice, we're not particularly observing them. We're not trying to block them, but we have no interest in them. We are simply being aware of being aware. Now, this practice, many people find quite challenging again, not because it's complicated. In fact, it's so simple. That's why people find it difficult. Because we always want to do something. Whereas in this practice, it's not so much of doing anything, rather than it's about being. And most of us really have not so much experience of just being. We're always doing. So it's quite challenging to just be instead of do. So here, we're just being. We're just being aware of being aware. Very, very simple. But again, not easy because we don't have the habit. Okay, that's all I wanted to really mention. Is there any questions on this practice? Again, there is a lot of benefits by doing this practice. One is that we really start to be able to be rather than always do, which is a good start. Yeah. And in terms of being, when we be aware of being aware, what we notice is that awareness has no limit. And it's not some tiny little constricted thing. And that experience of awareness is an experience of pure stillness. So by being aware of being aware, we're resting in a very open, spacious, still state. And if we can get used to doing that, then in daily life, we can bring that into daily life. In daily life, we can be resting in that still, open, spacious awareness in the midst of all appearances without jumping and contracting around appearances. And so therefore, it's very helpful in daily life to be able to stay calm, balanced in the midst of all this busy world. Also, of course, resting in awareness, like the previous practice, by simply resting in awareness, we really start to come to see the nature of the mind. And so particularly this practice is also a very good bridge into the Vipassana practice, because by simply resting in awareness, it's often the case that people start to have a little intuitive insight into the nature of the mind. So it's a very good bridge into the Vipassana practice as well. So that's why we're doing this practice. It's a lot of benefit in this practice. Any questions about it before we go back into the practice?
One. I think I got this idea that if I can't do the first step, I should not do number 3. Or, you know, that there's a certain way that I should go.
In terms of breath, mind, awareness,
Yeah.
or no? So with the shamatha practice, the recommendation is use the object that works best for you. For most of us, it probably will actually be the breath, because it's a tangible object. It's a little bit easier to begin to focus on. But actually, some beginners, when they're introduced to these 3 practices, some beginners actually are drawn and prefer looking at the mind, or even this practice of resting in awareness. So there's nothing that says, no, first you have to do the breath for some weeks or months. Only then can you start to do the mind. And then once you've done that for some months, then only then you can do awareness. There's nothing that says that. The reality is that many people do find the mind and awareness practice quite challenging. But I think if we are drawn to those practices and we're enthusiastic about those practices, then even if we find them difficult, because we have enthusiasm and we sort of relate to them a bit, that is enough of a basis to begin with that practice. If we find these practices difficult and we're not so enthusiastic about it, then probably not a good idea to start with the mind or awareness, because we're just going to get frustrated and give up. Whereas even if we find them difficult, but somehow we feel some good connection with them and we're enthusiastic about them, that will help us to go through that initial difficult phase of starting to get into the practice. But yes, you can, if you prefer, start with the breath, work with that for some time until you become more stable and clear, then move on to one of these practices. But there's nothing that says you have to do that. You could start with this practice from the very beginning. If you're strongly drawn to it and you're really enthusiastic about it, then no problem with starting with this practice or the mind practice. Okay. One more point, and then we'll go do the meditation. As with all the shamatha practices, we're trying to find this balance between agitation, distraction, and dullness, being too tight, too loose. And here in the awareness of awareness practice, we're going to engage in a little bit of a balancing exercise, as we did a little bit in the earlier practice. And again, we're going to sort of conjoin it a little bit with the breath. And that is that the out breath is a sort of a natural time to really release, relax, release, and open. So what we're going to do in this practice is we're going to do a little bit of an oscillation. Is that to help overcome the agitation tension being too tight, we're going to, at one point there, we're going to really, just particularly using the out breath, is just really relax and release all grasping, release sort of the mind into space, the awareness into space, to emphasize relaxation, to overcome this tightness and tension. And we're going to rest there for a bit. Then we're going to go to the other balancing, and that is we're going to overcome being dull or spaced out, we're going to sharpen our focus on being aware of being aware, to overcome dullness. So we're going to do that oscillation a little bit to get that balance, and then we're going to let go of the oscillation and just rest, hopefully in a more balanced state, sort of avoiding the agitation and the dullness. So that's how we're going to approach this meditation. And again, with this practice, like the mind practice, recommendation, eyes at least slightly open, vacantly resting gaze in space in front of you. Okay, so let's do this meditation and then we can have a lunch break after that. Okay. Again, we can begin by bringing our awareness into the body, becoming aware of sensations throughout the body. And using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. Not trying to control the breath in any way. And with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen. In particular, letting go of any expectations for this meditation. And simply allow the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Focusing on the sensations of the breath throughout the body. And allowing the eyes to be at least partially open. Vacantly resting your gaze in the space in front of you. And then simply release all appearances. And simply rest in the experience of awareness itself. without really doing anything at all, without even trying to meditate. Just be. Simply be aware of being aware. All sorts of appearances will continue to arise. But now pay no attention to any appearance and simply rest in luminously clear awareness. Now, to help balance awareness, to help overcome agitation and distraction, simply release awareness into space in all directions, relaxing completely, releasing all appearances. Completely relaxed. And then to help overcome dullness or being spaced out, arouse and refresh your focus right into the present moment, right into the experience of awareness itself. Completely clear and alert. And once again, releasing awareness into space, releasing all appearances, relaxing completely. And once again, arousing and refreshing the focus, being aware of being aware. Then relaxing and releasing all appearances. And again, arousing the attention, being aware of being aware. And simply allow the mind to come to rest. Resting in awareness itself. Relaxed and alert. Completely open and spacious. Any questions or comments before we break for lunch?
I'm just curious about something. Why is it that all these old memories come up with this meditation? I'm just curious about that.
Actually, it's not just this meditation, but see, the thing is that we are often actively, whether we're consciously or subconsciously, suppressing lots of stuff. And often we are so caught up in what's going on around us, even if things come up, we don't really notice them. Whereas in this and related practices, we are cultivating this calm, clear, spacious mind and not suppressing. So therefore, a lot of things will come up and we'll start to notice them. So it's very common in this practice, and particularly if you go into retreat, that a lot of old memories come up that maybe you've not had that memory since that experience 20, 30, 40 years ago. That's very common. And actually then that's a good sign that we are cultivating that state whereby we're not suppressing these things, because some of the things we suppress are things that we don't really want to acknowledge, maybe some unpleasant experience we had. And by not acknowledging it and suppressing it, it really manifests often as a lot of physical problems, and then we project a lot of this negativity onto others. So this practice, particularly observing the mind and resting in awareness, is also very much a healing practice, because when these things come up and we simply acknowledge them, that often is enough to go through the healing process. And if not, that would be the beginnings of the healing process. So this is a very, very common.
So you're releasing it by just letting it be.
Yeah, you're letting it be, meaning you're not suppressing.
Yeah.
And often simply acknowledging these things is a way of then being able to let them go. If not, that's the beginnings of then some sort of healing process. So this is very common.
Cool.
Anything else anyone would like to bring up?
My intuition said this is where compassion starts. I could feel this just, wow, I can't really describe it any more than that. Kindness.
Yeah.
Immense kind of kindness.
Yeah. So what, I mentioned that particularly this practice and even one before is sort of on the bridge to Vipassana, into insight. And particularly this practice, which is a much more non-dualistic style of practice, there's not really a sense of me and them. And so when we're in that open, spacious state, that is the state from which the boundless love and compassion can arise. So even though this is really a shamatha practice, it can lead to beginnings of those sorts of experiences. And on top of this shamatha practice, if we go into the Vipassana practice and we realize what this non-dualistic state really means, that is really the source for this boundless compassion to arise. So yes, this can have that sort of effect. So it's very common that even though this is really just a shamatha practice, it's just about developing a calm, clear, focused mind, because of the style of the shamatha practice, it can actually start to, one, gain insight into your mind and the nature of reality, and two, start to have these sort of beginnings of compassion and loving kindness coming out of this state. This is also quite common. Okay, let's break for lunch. Come back at 1:30. After lunch, we're going to go into the compassion practice, and then in the last session, we're going to look at how to integrate all these things into our daily life. Okay, let's have some lunch first.